They thought he was just a simple farmer. He grew peppers, fed chickens, and cracked jokes with people who could eliminate you in 5 seconds. But on June 18th at 3:12 a.m., this farmer vanished along with $6 million of cartel money, and nobody has seen Jacob Wells since. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now let's get back to the story. At exactly 2:47 a.m. on that humid Texas night, Jacob Wells drove his rusted John Deere tractor straight into a warehouse that belonged to the most dangerous drug cartel in North America. He had a copy of the key and codes to every safe inside. What happened next took exactly 11 minutes and changed everything. 6 boxes of cash were loaded into a van hidden in his cattle barn. The boxes that remained were filled with sand and fake bills that looked real enough to fool anyone who did not look too closely. Jake started a tire fire in his backyard as a distraction, sending thick black smoke into the night sky that would keep the neighbors focused in the wrong direction. The security cameras had been reprogrammed weeks earlier by an IT specialist named Cole Martinez, who thought he was helping Jake upgrade his farm's security system. Cole had no idea he was actually helping plan one of the most audacious thefts in Texas history. But this story really begins 2 years earlier when Jake overheard a conversation that would change his life forever. He was fixing a fence near the back of his property when he heard voices speaking Spanish near the old grain silo. 2 men in expensive suits were discussing moving millions of dollars through his land, using the abandoned buildings as temporary storage. That was the moment Jake realized his failing pepper farm was sitting on top of a gold mine. What those cartel members did not know was that Jacob Wells was not actually a simple farmer. He was a former CIA intelligence operative who had been dismissed from service in 2015 under circumstances that remained classified. Something had gone wrong during an operation in Moscow, but the details were buried so deep that even Jake sometimes wondered what really happened. His security clearance was revoked, his career was destroyed, and he was left with nothing but a small inheritance and a rundown farm in rural Texas. The dismissal had cost Jake everything, including his relationship with his son Justin, who lived in Colorado and had not spoken to his father in 6 years. People said that after losing his job, Jake had become obsessed with conspiracy theories and intelligence work, unable to accept that his career was over. The fighting between father and son had been brutal, with Justin eventually cutting off all contact and refusing to take Jake's phone calls. But Jake's intelligence training had never left him. He spent months conducting surveillance on the cartel operation, learning their schedules, studying their security procedures, and mapping every detail of their money storage system. He discovered that the warehouse was used twice a month to hold cash shipments before they were moved to Mexico. The amounts varied, but Jake calculated that the average shipment contained between $4 and $8 million. During his surveillance, Jake made a disturbing discovery that changed everything about his plan. He was not the first person to notice the cartel's operation. Hidden in the tall grass near the warehouse, Jake found the remnants of previous surveillance equipment. Broken cameras, rusted recording devices, and most chilling of all, a notebook containing detailed observations about cartel activities written in a hand that was not his own. The notebook belonged to someone who had been watching the warehouse for months, documenting guard rotation, shipment schedules, and security vulnerabilities. The last entry was dated 6 months earlier and simply read, "They know I am here." Jake realized he was following in the footsteps of someone who had tried to rob the cartel and failed. The question was whether that person had escaped or ended up buried in the Texas desert. Jake's investigation into the mysterious notebook led him to a shocking discovery. The handwriting belonged to Maria Santos, a former DEA agent who had gone missing 8 months earlier. Maria had been investigating cartel money laundering operations when she suddenly disappeared without a trace. Her colleagues assumed she had been discovered and eliminated, but Jake realized she might have tried to steal cartel money and either escaped or been caught in the attempt. This revelation made Jake reconsider his entire plan. If a trained DEA agent with federal resources had failed to successfully rob the cartel, what chance did a disgraced CIA operative have? But Jake also realized that Maria's failure might have been caused by factors he could avoid. Her mistake might have been trying to work within the system instead of operating completely outside it. Jake spent weeks studying Maria's notes and comparing them to his own observations. He discovered that she had focused on the money shipments, but had missed something crucial. The cartel was not just storing cash in the warehouse, they were also keeping something much more valuable. Hidden among the financial records were lists of corrupt officials, informants, and undercover agents working within law enforcement agencies. This information was worth far more than any amount of cash, because it could destroy the cartel's entire network if it fell into the wrong hands. Jake realized that stealing this intelligence data might be even more important than taking the money. The cartel would pay any price to recover information that could expose their sources and compromise ongoing operations. But Jake's discovery of the intelligence files also revealed a terrifying truth about his situation. The cartel had sources inside federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI. Jake found evidence that someone was feeding information to the cartel about ongoing investigations, raids, and surveillance operations. This meant that any contact with federal authorities could result in his immediate exposure and death. The intelligence files revealed the identity of the corrupt FBI agent who was working for the cartel. Special Agent Robert Chen had been feeding information to cartel leaders for over 2 years in exchange for payments totaling more than $500,000. Chen was in a position to access sensitive information about investigations, surveillance operations, and the identities of undercover agents. This discovery explained how the cartel had been able to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts and eliminate threats before they could develop into serious problems. It also meant that Jake could not trust anyone within the FBI or local law enforcement agencies. Any attempt to report the theft or seek protection would be immediately communicated to the cartel. Here's where Jake's plan got really dangerous. He realized he was not just fighting the cartel, he was also fighting corrupt officials within the government who would protect their criminal partners at any cost. This conspiracy made his situation exponentially more dangerous, but also presented an opportunity. If Jake could expose the corruption, he might be able to destroy both the cartel and their government protectors. On the night of June 18th, Jake put his expanded plan into action. He had been watching the warehouse for weeks and knew that the next shipment would include both cash and a new batch of intelligence files. The cartel stored this information on encrypted hard drives that were kept in the same vault as the money. Jake entered the warehouse using a key he had copied months earlier when he volunteered to help with some electrical work. The security system had been disabled by Cole, who thought he was testing new camera software. Jake moved quickly and efficiently, loading 6 metal boxes of cash and 3 encrypted hard drives into a specially modified van that had been hidden in his cattle barn for over a month. Each cash box contained bundled $100 bills wrapped in plastic and marked with symbols that indicated their destination. But when Jake examined the money more closely, he made a shocking discovery. Nearly half of the bills were sophisticated counterfeits that would fool casual inspection, but were worthless in reality. The cartel was using fake money to test their money laundering routes and identify potential security breaches. This meant that Jake had stolen less real money than he had planned, but the intelligence files were potentially worth much more than any amount of cash. The encrypted drives contained not only lists of corrupt officials, but also detailed information about cartel operations across multiple countries. This data could be used to destroy the entire organization if Jake could find a way to safely release it. Jake replaced the stolen items with identical containers filled with sand-cut newspaper and fake hard drives that would pass a quick inspection. The decoy boxes even had the correct weight and markings to fool anyone who did not examine them closely. Jake also left behind a small surprise for anyone who opened the real vault, a note that read, "You should have been more careful about your hiring practices." The entire operation took exactly 11 minutes from start to finish. Jake drove the van back to his farm, loaded the boxes and drives into a grain silo that had been modified with a hidden compartment, and set the tire fire to create a distraction. By 3:15 a.m., he was sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee and watching the smoke rise into the night sky. The cartel arrived at 4:21 a.m., expecting to find their money and intelligence files ready for transport. Instead, they discovered what appeared to be the aftermath of a professional robbery. The security cameras showed a figure in a cowboy hat moving through the warehouse, but the image quality was too poor to make a positive identification. The missing money and professional execution of the theft convinced the cartel leadership that they had been targeted by either rival criminals or federal agents. The investigation quickly focused on Jake, when cartel informants reported that a local farmer had been asking suspicious questions about warehouse security and had volunteered to help with electrical work. Jake's CIA background made him an obvious suspect, but the cartel was puzzled by why a disgraced intelligence operative would risk his life for a relatively small amount of money. Carlos Mendez, the cartel's security chief, ordered a massive investigation to determine who had robbed them and recover the stolen intelligence files. The money was important, but the intelligence data was absolutely critical because it contained information that could destroy their entire American operation if it fell into the wrong hands. But here's where things got terrifying for Jake. Within 6 hours of the robbery, Carlos had teams searching every farm within 20 miles of the warehouse. They were moving fast and they were thorough. Jake watched from his kitchen window as black SUVs drove slowly past his property, counting the vehicles and noting which farms showed signs of recent activity. Jake had prepared for this moment by creating false evidence that would suggest he had been asleep during the robbery. He had set up an alibi by leaving his truck at a bar in town the previous evening and getting a ride home from a neighbor who would remember dropping him off at 10 p.m. Jake's plan was to appear hungover and confused when the cartel came to question him. The first close call came at 8:30 a.m. when 2 cartel operatives knocked on Jake's front door, claiming to be insurance investigators looking into reports of suspicious fires in the area. Jake played the role of a confused and cooperative farmer, answering their questions while still wearing his pajamas and acting like he had just woken up. The investigators asked about the tire fire in his backyard, and Jake explained that he had been burning old tires to clear space for new equipment. He offered them coffee and even showed them around his property, pointing out various farm improvements he had been making. The investigators found nothing suspicious, but Jake could tell they were not entirely convinced by his performance. They seemed ready to leave when one of them noticed fresh tire tracks leading from Jake's barn to the main road. The tracks were exactly the type that would be left by a heavy van carrying a substantial load. Jake's heart started racing, but he managed to explain that he had borrowed a neighbor's truck to haul some feed the previous day. The explanation seemed to satisfy the investigators, but Jake knew they would be back with a more thorough search team. That afternoon, Jake activated his emergency escape protocol, loading essential supplies into a pickup truck and preparing to abandon his farm. He left behind a carefully crafted scene that would suggest he had departed suddenly for personal reasons rather than criminal activity. But Jake's escape was nearly ruined by a stroke of bad luck that almost cost him everything. As he was driving away from his farm, Jake was stopped at a routine traffic checkpoint that had been set up to catch drunk drivers. The officer who approached his truck was Deputy Tom Morrison, a local cop who had been bought and paid for by the cartel. Morrison recognized Jake from surveillance photos that the cartel had distributed to their law enforcement contacts. Instead of checking Jake's license and letting him go, Morrison radioed for backup while pretending to conduct a routine sobriety test. Jake realized what was happening when he saw Morrison speaking in code words that Jake recognized from his intelligence training. Jake knew he had maybe 2 minutes before cartel reinforcements arrived at the checkpoint. He needed to disable Morrison and escape without creating a scene that would attract attention from other drivers. Jake pretended to stumble during the sobriety test and managed to get close enough to Morrison to strike a pressure point that rendered the corrupt deputy unconscious. Jake dragged Morrison behind the police car and took his radio communication equipment before driving away. The entire incident took less than 90 seconds, but Jake knew it would not be long before the cartel realized that Morrison had been compromised. Jake needed to get as far away as possible before they could organize a proper search. Jake drove through the night using back roads and avoiding major highways where the cartel might have set up additional checkpoints. He had prepared multiple safe houses in neighboring states and was planning to reach one of them before dawn. But Jake's problems were just beginning because the cartel had resources and connections that reached far beyond Texas. The next morning, Jake woke up in a cheap motel in Oklahoma where he had registered under a false name. He turned on the television to check local news reports and was shocked to see his own face staring back at him from the screen. The cartel had somehow convinced local authorities to issue a warrant for Jake's arrest on charges of assaulting a police officer and theft. The news report described Jake as a dangerous fugitive who might be armed and should not be approached by civilians. A reward of $50,000 was being offered for information leading to his capture. Jake realized that the cartel was using their law enforcement contacts to turn every police officer in the region into a bounty hunter. Jake quickly packed his belongings and prepared to leave the motel, but as he opened the door, he saw 2 police cars pulling into the parking lot. The officers were not there for him, but Jake could not take any chances. He slipped out the back window of his room and made his way to his truck while the officers were busy with another guest. Jake managed to escape from the motel parking lot without being detected, but he knew his situation was becoming desperate. Every police officer in the region was looking for him, and the cartel had unlimited resources to fund their search. Jake needed to find a way to disappear completely before they could corner him. Here's the moment when everything almost fell apart. Jake was driving through a small town in Arkansas when he stopped at a gas station to refuel his truck. While he was pumping gas, Jake noticed a man in an expensive suit watching him from across the street. The man was speaking on a cell phone and kept glancing in Jake's direction. Jake finished fueling his truck and went inside the gas station to pay. While he was waiting in line, Jake overheard the cashier talking to someone on the phone about a suspicious customer who matched the description of a wanted fugitive. Jake realized that the gas station owner had recognized him from the television news reports. Jake paid for his gas with cash and walked calmly back to his truck while calculating his options. The man in the expensive suit was still watching him, and Jake could see additional vehicles approaching from both directions. Jake started his engine and prepared to make a run for it. What happened next was straight out of an action movie. Jake floored the accelerator and drove his truck straight through the gas station's plate glass window, creating a massive distraction. While everyone was running for cover, Jake escaped through the chaos and disappeared into the countryside before anyone could organize a pursuit. The spectacular escape bought Jake precious time, but it also confirmed to the cartel that they were dealing with someone who had professional training and would not be captured easily. Carlos Mendez realized that Jake Wells was far more dangerous than they had initially believed and began treating him as a serious threat to their operations. Jake spent the next week moving constantly and never staying in the same location for more than a few hours. He used a network of abandoned buildings, remote campsites, and cheap motels to avoid detection while monitoring police communications and news reports. Jake was exhausted and running low on supplies, but he refused to give up. The breakthrough in Jake's escape came when he remembered something from his CIA training about using the enemy's own resources against them. Jake realized that the cartel's greatest strength, their network of corrupt law enforcement officials, could also be their greatest weakness if he could find a way to expose it. Jake began implementing a psychological warfare campaign designed to turn the cartel's allies against each other. He started by sending anonymous tips to honest FBI agents about the activities of their corrupt colleagues. Jake provided just enough evidence to start investigations without revealing how he had obtained the information. The strategy worked better than Jake had hoped. Within days, several corrupt agents were under internal investigation, and the cartel began to suspect that they had a traitor in their ranks. The paranoia spread quickly through their organization as leaders began questioning the loyalty of their law enforcement contacts. But Jake's psychological warfare campaign also created new dangers for him. The cartel began using more extreme methods to find him, including kidnapping and interrogating anyone who might have information about his location. Several innocent people were hurt during these operations, and Jake felt responsible for putting them in danger. The guilt over innocent casualties almost caused Jake to surrender himself to the cartel to stop the violence. But Jake realized that giving up would accomplish nothing except ensuring his own death, while allowing the corruption network to continue operating. Jake decided to accelerate his timeline and implement the final phase of his plan. Meanwhile, the cartel had been hunting for anyone who had helped Jake with the robbery. Their investigation led them to Cole Martinez, the IT specialist who had worked on the warehouse security system. Cole had been planning to leave the country and was at the airport preparing to board a flight to Spain when cartel operatives found him. Cole was taken to a secure location where Carlos Mendez personally interrogated him about his role in the robbery. Cole initially claimed that he had only helped Jake with routine computer work and had no knowledge of any criminal activity. But Carlos was an experienced interrogator who could tell when someone was lying. Under intense questioning, Cole eventually admitted that he had disabled the security cameras and helped Jake gain access to the warehouse. But Cole insisted that Jake had told him they were conducting a legitimate investigation into suspected criminal activity. Cole claimed he had been tricked into helping with the robbery and had no idea that Jake was planning to steal money. Carlos did not believe Cole's story and suspected that the IT specialist was part of a larger conspiracy against the cartel. Carlos ordered his men to hold Cole prisoner while they investigated his background and connections. What they discovered was even more disturbing than Carlos had expected. Cole Martinez was not just a freelance IT specialist. He was an undercover FBI agent who had been investigating the cartel's operations for over 18 months. Cole had been assigned to gather intelligence about their money laundering activities and identify corrupt officials who were protecting their operations. His work with Jake had been part of a larger federal investigation. This discovery sent shockwaves through the cartel's leadership. If Cole was an undercover agent, then the FBI knew far more about their operations than they had realized. The robbery might have been part of a federal sting operation designed to gather evidence for major prosecutions. Carlos immediately ordered a complete review of their security procedures and began planning to eliminate anyone who might be working with law enforcement. But Cole's capture also created an opportunity for the cartel. If they could force Cole to contact Jake and arrange a meeting, they might be able to capture the man who had stolen their money and intelligence files. Carlos ordered his men to make Cole call Jake and arrange a face-to-face meeting under the pretense of discussing their escape plan. Cole was given a script to follow during the phone call, but he managed to include a subtle warning that only someone with intelligence training would recognize. When Cole told Jake that they needed to meet at the old Cotton Gin because the weather was getting too hot, Jake immediately understood that Cole had been captured and the meeting was a trap. Jake had worked with enough undercover agents during his CIA career to recognize distress signals and coded warnings. The phrase about hot weather was not something Cole would normally say, and Jake realized that his accomplice was in serious danger. Jake wanted to help Cole escape, but he also knew that walking into the cartel's trap would accomplish nothing except getting them both eliminated. Instead, Jake decided to create a diversion that would give Cole a chance to escape, while also confusing the cartel about his own location. Jake called the local sheriff's department from a payphone and reported a major drug shipment arriving at the warehouse where Cole was being held. Jake provided enough specific details to convince the authorities that the tip was legitimate. The sheriff's department contacted the DEA and FBI, who quickly organized a raid on the warehouse. The law enforcement operation created chaos that allowed Cole to escape from his captors during the confusion. Cole had been trained to take advantage of exactly this type of situation and managed to slip away while the cartel members were dealing with the federal agents. Cole's escape infuriated Carlos Mendez, who realized that he had been outmaneuvered once again by Jake Wells. The failed trap had also exposed one of their safe houses to law enforcement and forced the cartel to abandon several other locations that might have been compromised. Jake's quick thinking had saved Cole's life while dealing another blow to the cartel's operations. But the incident also made it clear to Jake that he could not remain in the United States much longer. The cartel was getting closer to finding him, and their investigation was becoming more sophisticated. Jake needed to accelerate his escape plan and leave the country before they could organize another attempt to capture him. Here's where Jake made his most dangerous gamble yet. Instead of continuing to run, Jake decided to go on the offensive and destroy the cartel's operations completely. He would use the stolen intelligence files to expose the entire corruption network and eliminate the threat permanently. It was incredibly risky, but Jake believed it was his only chance for true freedom. Jake began by decrypting the stolen hard drives and analyzing the intelligence files they contained. What he discovered was even more damaging than he had hoped. The files contained detailed records of payments to corrupt officials, names of undercover agents who had been compromised, and evidence of murders that had been covered up by law enforcement. Jake realized that he possessed information that could destroy not only the cartel, but also dozens of corrupt officials at every level of government. The files contained enough evidence to trigger congressional investigations and send people to prison for life. But using this information would require extreme care because the corrupt officials would eliminate Jake without hesitation to protect their secrets. Jake's solution was characteristically brilliant and audacious. He would release the information in a way that would trigger multiple investigations and prosecutions while keeping his own role hidden. Jake planned to send the intelligence files to investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, and honest law enforcement officials, simultaneously creating a media firestorm that would be impossible to suppress. Jake spent weeks preparing anonymous packages containing copies of the most damaging files and evidence. Each package was carefully crafted to provide enough information to launch comprehensive investigations while avoiding any references that could lead back to him. Jake included detailed explanations of how the corruption network operated and specific instructions for verifying the authenticity of the information. The packages were mailed from different locations using false return addresses and untraceable postage methods that Jake had learned during his CIA training. Jake used a network of mail forwarding services and anonymous remailing systems to ensure that the packages could not be traced back to their origin. Within days of mailing the packages, Jake's strategy began to work exactly as planned. News reports started appearing about massive corruption within federal law enforcement agencies. Congressional hearings were announced and multiple grand juries were impaneled to investigate the allegations. The corrupt officials found themselves fighting for their professional and personal survival. The chaos created by these revelations provided perfect cover for Jake's final escape plan. While law enforcement resources were focused on investigating the corruption scandal, Jake was able to move freely and convert his stolen assets into untraceable forms. He purchased gold jewelry, cryptocurrency, and other portable wealth that could be easily transported and converted anywhere in the world. Jake also established multiple offshore bank accounts and shell companies that would allow him to access his money from any country without leaving traces that could be followed by investigators. The process required Jake to travel extensively using false identities, but his intelligence training had prepared him for exactly this type of complex financial operation. The cartel, meanwhile, was facing its own crisis as the corruption scandal destroyed their network of protection within law enforcement agencies. Multiple arrests and investigations had eliminated most of their sources and left them vulnerable to prosecution for the first time in years. Carlos Mendez found himself fighting to preserve what remained of their American operations. But Jake's victory came at a personal cost that he had not fully anticipated. The stress of being hunted by the cartel and the guilt over the innocent people who had been hurt during his escape had taken a serious toll on his mental and physical health. Jake was exhausted, paranoid, and struggling with depression that made it difficult for him to enjoy his success. Jake also missed his son Justin more than he had expected. The separation from his only family member was painful, and Jake often wondered whether his quest for revenge had been worth the price he was paying. But Jake knew there was no going back to his old life, and that he had to find a way to build something new from the ruins of his past. Jake's departure from the United States was carefully planned to avoid detection by both law enforcement and cartel surveillance. He used a series of different vehicles and identities to travel across multiple states before finally crossing into Mexico at a remote border location that was not heavily monitored by official agencies. But even crossing the border was dangerous because the cartel had connections throughout Mexico and Central America. Jake had to be extremely careful to avoid areas where the cartel operated while also staying ahead of any American law enforcement officers who might be pursuing him. From Mexico, Jake traveled to Central America, where he had arranged to purchase a new identity from forgers who specialized in creating documents for people who needed to disappear permanently. The process took several weeks and cost Jake nearly $100,000, but he eventually emerged with a complete new identity backed by authentic-looking documentation. Jake established himself in a small coastal community where he was known as a retired businessman who had moved there for the climate and privacy. He used his converted assets to purchase a modest house and establish a simple lifestyle that would not attract attention from local authorities or curious neighbors. The cartel never stopped looking for Jake, but their search was severely hampered by the ongoing federal investigation that had been triggered by the stolen intelligence files. Multiple arrests and raids had destroyed much of their American network and forced them to focus on protecting their remaining assets rather than pursuing one missing shipment. Jake monitored news reports about the investigation from his new home and was satisfied to see that his theft had accomplished far more than he had originally intended. The corruption network that had protected the cartel for years was being systematically dismantled, and dozens of criminals and corrupt officials were facing prosecution. But Jake's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that Cole Martinez had survived his capture and was continuing to work with federal authorities to destroy the cartel's operations. Jake had risked his own safety to save Cole, and the gamble had paid off in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. 6 months after his escape, Jake received an encrypted message through a secure communication channel that only intelligence professionals would know how to access. The message was brief and simply said, "Thank you for the rescue, and the intel files are destroying them." Jake knew it was from Cole, and that his former accomplice was safe and continuing his work against the cartel. Jake never responded to the message, knowing that any communication could potentially compromise Cole's safety or his own security. But he kept the message as a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing required taking enormous risks, and that even former enemies could become allies when fighting against corruption. 1 year after the theft, Jake was living peacefully in his coastal paradise when he decided to send one final message to his estranged son, Justin. Jake had learned that Justin was working as a computer programmer in Denver and had apparently built a successful career despite the difficult relationship with his father. Jake composed a carefully worded email that would convey his general location without revealing too much information to anyone who might intercept the message. The email included a photograph of Jake standing on a tropical beach holding a red pepper that would remind Justin of their shared past on the farm. The message read, "Don't forget the farm. You remember which plants are the honest ones. I am good. Really. And you know where to find me. Just don't tell anyone." The coordinates embedded in the photograph's metadata pointed to Jake's general location, but were encrypted using a code that only Justin would be able to decipher based on childhood memories they shared. Jake never knew whether Justin received the message or chose to ignore it. Some people believed that father and son eventually reunited in secret, while others thought Justin simply deleted the message and tried to forget about his criminal father. The truth remained known only to Justin himself, and he never spoke publicly about his father's disappearance. What Jake did know was that his theft had accomplished something far more important than simply enriching himself. The $6 million he had stolen had been the key that unlocked a much larger victory against corruption and criminal activity. The intelligence files he had taken had exposed a network of corrupt officials and led to prosecutions that protected honest law enforcement officers and innocent citizens. Jake had also proved that sometimes one person with sufficient determination and intelligence could challenge the most powerful criminal organizations and win. His success had required careful planning, enormous risks, and more than a little luck, but the results had exceeded his wildest expectations and changed the landscape of organized crime in America. The case of the missing Texas farmer remained officially unsolved, and Jacob Wells remained officially missing. But Jake knew that his mission was complete and that he had achieved a form of justice that the legal system had been unable to provide. He had taken revenge against the corrupt forces that had destroyed his career, while also protecting innocent people from criminal violence. Sometimes in the evenings, Jake would sit on his porch overlooking the ocean and think about the night he had driven his tractor into that warehouse and changed the course of his life forever. He had started as a bitter ex-agent seeking money and revenge, but had ended as an instrument of justice who had helped protect his country from corruption that threatened its very foundation. The pepper farm where Jake had once struggled to make a living was eventually sold to developers who had no idea of its role in one of the most audacious thefts in American history. The grain silo where Jake had hidden his stolen fortune was demolished, and the land was converted into a shopping center that served the growing suburban community around it. But the legacy of Jake's theft lived on in the honest law enforcement officers who could now do their jobs without fear of betrayal, and in the communities that were safer because corrupt officials had been removed from positions of power. Jake had proven that sometimes breaking the law was the only way to restore justice and protect innocent people from criminal violence and corruption. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.